Newport Historical Society for inviting me, and to all of you for coming out. Even though I've spoken at a lot of historical sites around Boston, and I've done research in the Rhode Island archives, this is my Rhode Island speaking debut. So thank you very much for having gotten me here. I also have to say, the more I read about Rhode Island politics, colonial politics, the more it feels dark and mysterious. And some folks in this audience might in fact know more about that, and I'd be happy to hear correctives during the question session. I apologize in advance if I don't pick up subtle clues about this colony's state. But I'll do my best. The story I'm telling tonight starts with the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor on December 16, 1773. And this English political print showing Americans abusing a customs official is also the earliest picture of what we later called the Tea Party. See, it's in the background there. You can see men tossing tea overboard. Later pictures of the Tea Party depict those men usually in full Indian costume, bare-chested with feathers and war paint. This picture shows men in ordinary clothing simply going about the business of emptying tea chests into Boston Harbor. And it may actually be more accurate, according to the recollections of this man, Ebenezer Stevens. Before the Revolutionary War, he was a housewright, which was a type of carpenter who built things, built buildings. At the end of the war, he was a colonel in the Continental Army. He settled in New York. He became a merchant. The painter John Trumbull created this miniature portrait of him, which is now at the Yale Art Gallery. Ebenezer Stevens prospered. His sons prospered. They became a prominent New York family. One of his descendants was the novelist Edith Wharton, and her parents had a house, summer house here in Newport when she was growing up. That's getting ahead of the story. Here's what Ebenezer Stevens wrote about what he did during the tea crisis of 1773. Boston held big public meetings here in the Old South Meeting House, which was the largest building in town. Starting in late November, thousands of people gathered there to protest how the royal government planned to collect the tea tax. These weren't official town meetings, but the town clerk was there taking notes on what happened. And on November 28th, the first ship arrived. Boston was already ready. The meeting recruited volunteers to patrol the wharf where the ship had docked to make sure that the tea was never taken off the ship onto land, because then it would be taxed. And here at the top you can see Ebenezer Stevens' name on the list of men, one of the lists of men who volunteered to patrol the docks. Eventually, the meetings decided there was too much trouble to recruit individually every night. The town clerk probably got tired writing down all these names, so it just asked the town's militia companies to take turns patrolling the docks. Stevens was a member of the militia company called the Train, which handled artillery. Boston was very proud of the Train. Their co-founder and commander, Major Edno Paddock, had gotten his company special training from the British Royal Artillery during the winter of 1766. And they had 4 small brass cannons, and this is a picture of one of them, that were stored in 2 specially built gun houses, or small armories, near the center of town, and that is the actual plan for one of the gun houses for the Boston Public Library. On holidays, like the King's birthday, the Train would parade and fire their cannon and salute. And on militia training days, they would go out to war games on Boston Common, with half the squad being the British and half the squad being the hated French, and the British always won. According to Stevens, the company commander, Paddock, whose sympathies were with the royal authorities, refused to patrol the wharf. But the first lieutenant, the next officer down, said, "Oh, no, we have plenty of men. Most of the men are opposed to the tea tax." They went out and patrolled the wharf instead. So Stevens probably was among that group. In addition to that night when he volunteered, later he did some more patrol duty on Griffin's Wharf. On the night of December 16th was the deadline for collecting the tea tax. So the crisis had to be resolved in Boston at that point. Thousands of people were jammed into Old South, including Stevens. As the afternoon ended, they learned that a last-minute compromise proposal had fallen through, and Samuel Adams announced that this meeting could do nothing more to save the country. And a few minutes later, a crowd of men walked by outside, whistling and shouting and hollering, and the young men inside the meeting house, including Stevens, knew what that meant. that those men were going to resolve the tea crisis by physical force. They were going to make sure that those cargoes never got on shore. According to Stevens, I went from the Old South Meeting House just after dark. The party was about 70 or 80. Stevens particularly said none of the party were painted as Indians, nor that I know of disguised, excepting some of them stopped at a paint shop on the way and daubed their faces with paint. At the head of the wharf, we met the detachment of our company on guard. That night, it just happened, coincidence, that the patrol on the wharf was taken from the artillery company, from the train. But those guards, they saw all these men coming, they didn't stop. They didn't tell them to stop, they joined in. Stevens' militia comrades weren't the only people he recognized on Griffin's Wharf that night. He had a friend named Alexander Hodgson, who was a first mate on one of the ships. And so he decided, oh, I'll go to this ship over here so that my friend will recognize me and we won't have any problem with me being pointed out later. As he knew me, I left that vessel with some of my comrades and went on board the other vessel, which lay at the opposite side of the wharf. Numbers of others took our places on board Hodgson's vessel. We commenced handling the boxes of tea on the deck, and first commenced breaking them down with axes, but found much difficulty, owing to the boxes of tea being covered with canvas, the mode that this article is then imported in. I think that all the tea was discharged in about 2 hours. Now, the night didn't go smoothly for all the men in the Boston train. Another member was a man named John Crane, a sergeant in that militia company. We don't have a picture of John Crane, unfortunately, so I'm showing the house in Boston where he lived, with his wife and children, and his gravestone in Maine. He's not looking at his best here, but this is the best I can do. Crane was a housewright, like Stevens. He had volunteered, like Stevens, to patrol Griffin's Wharf. In fact, as you can see by his name at the bottom of this list, he had volunteered on the very first night. On December 16th, Crane was also at Griffin's Wharf, either as part of the patrol or perhaps coming with the crowd that showed up after dark. And like Stevens and the rest of the train, he went to work destroying the tea chests. According to a later profile of Crane, a derrick used in hoisting out the tea fell on his head and knocked him senseless. His comrades, supposing him killed, bore him into a neighboring carpenter's shop and secreted the body under a pile of shavings. Now this is one of these details which makes you think, how drunk were these people? Because your friend is just knocked out and you think he's dead and you think, oh, we'll just stuff him under this sawdust. They afterwards took him to his home where good nursing and a strong constitution soon brought him round. All told, the Tea Party, as it was eventually called, destroyed more than 9,600 pounds worth of tea. Adjusted to inflation, that is almost $1 million worth of property damage in 2 hours. Another comparison, when an anti-Stamp Act mob destroyed the house, the furniture, the clothing, the books of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson in 1765, he estimated his damages as 2,500 pounds. So the tea was worth nearly 4 furnished mansions. The government in London did not like that. Now here I have to acknowledge that there have been some other extensive acts of destruction in the previous 8 years. In fact, several of them happened here in Narragansett Bay. In June 1765, a mob in Newport dragged a boat from the Royal Navy warship Gagestone to Newport Common and set it on fire. In July 1769, another mob off Newport attacked the Customs Patrol ship Liberty, which had been confiscated from John Hancock. They set it on fire and much burned to the waterline. And of course, in June 1772, men from Providence attacked the Royal Navy ship Gaspé, shooting a gun at the lieutenant in charge, and then of course, they set it on fire, as shown in this painting. So one mystery I've been worrying about for years is why the British government in 1774 came down so hard on Boston and Massachusetts when Rhode Island was clearly this very destructive, dangerous place for British government ships. Maybe the Gaspé incident had in fact primed the British government that says, okay, the next thing that happens, we cannot let go, and they have to be very strict. Another possibility is that Boston is a bigger town, it's got more economic value, so London couldn't ignore it. But probably the biggest factor is that the royal government didn't have a lot of officials here in Rhode Island to carry out its policies. This colony elected its governor. Rhode Island and Connecticut were the only British colonies that still had that privilege. In contrast, since 1692, the Crown appointed the royal governor and appointed the judges in Massachusetts. That gave the ministers in London a lot more room to maneuver within the existing constitution. Parliament started with two measures. The first was the Boston Port Bill, which barred ships from other parts of the British Empire from bringing goods into Boston Harbor until the town collected and paid back that 9,600 pounds for the tea. That law was supposed to cripple Boston economically. No ships in the harbor, not much economy. Parliament expected the shipping to go to other harbors in New England, including Newport. So they thought that these other harbors would actually be happy that they'd be getting more business now, and they wouldn't support Boston. That didn't work out. The second measure was for the Crown was to appoint General Thomas Gage, the new royal governor of Massachusetts. He personally promised King George III that he could impose discipline on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Gage was already commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America, and he planned to bring several more army regiments to Boston to make sure that the town stayed peaceful. Basically, by the time he had troops arriving by the end of the summer of 1774, he had one soldier for every adult male in Boston. And Parliament wasn't done yet, because Boston wasn't done either. On May 7th, 1774, men of the town went out to the docks and dumped a fourth shipload of tea into the water. We don't hear much about this second tea party, but news of it reached London just as Parliament was thinking, oh, what should we do, what should we do, are they going to be... And they realized, oh, we have to be very strict. They gave up any thoughts of leniency when they heard about the second tea party. And they began to write a new law that would change Massachusetts' government permanently. General Gage arrived in Boston on May 13th, 1774, accompanied by some regular troops. Major Paddock mustered the Boston train of artillery to salute the new governor, and that was the last time that John Crane and Ebenezer Stevens marched with that militia company. Shortly afterwards, both of those house rights left for Providence. The Stevens family tradition offered two reasons why he left. One, in consequence of the stagnation of business consequent upon the closing of the port. In other words, the Boston's commerce crippled. Who was going to invest in big new buildings? Wasn't good business for a house right. And two, apprehensive perhaps that his participation in the destruction of the tea might be visited upon him. If you had just helped to destroy $1 million worth of property and you hadn't even tried to disguise yourself while doing it, and now there are several army regiments coming into town, you might want to get out of town too. According to the early Rhode Island historian John Alton, Crane and Stevens came to Providence to work on this building, the first Baptist meeting house, being erected that year, 1774. Howland wrote, "The trade and business of Boston, of course, was at an end, and hundreds of the inhabitants had to leave the town to seek a living elsewhere. Many of the mechanics and merchants came to this town, and a number of the carpenters and masons were employed to work on the first Baptist meeting house, which was then building. Crane and Stevens were employed by Clark and Nightingale. The housewrights began to build a new foundation of new lives for themselves in Rhode Island. On October 11th, Ebenezer Stevens married a young New Hampshire woman named Rebecca Hodgson. You might remember Stevens' friend, Alexander Hodgson, the mate on the tea ship, whom he wanted to make sure didn't see him. Well, Rebecca Hodgson was Alexander's sister. Meanwhile, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act. That law changed the constitution of the colony. It limited many ways that Massachusetts' white men of property were used to governing themselves, from town meetings at the bottom all the way up to the upper house of the legislature, the council. And it was supposed to be permanent, as I said. After he received the Massachusetts Government Act in August of 1774, General Gage started to swear in the new non-elected members of the council. People in rural counties responded by surrounding the houses and carriages of those councilors and demanding that they not be sworn in or resign. Then, when it came time in late August 1774 for court sessions in the county seats, especially out in the western part of the county, the western part of the colony, hundreds of men turned out in their militia companies, not with guns, but 50, 100 men at a time, surrounded the courthouses and demanded that the judges not meet under the new law. They weren't carrying guns, but they still had a threat of, if not violence, at least force. They could intimidate any magistrates who might be inclined to resist. General Gage started to get worried. On September 1st, he took a preemptive step to limit the possibility of violence near Boston. He sent troops to this gunpowder storage house, which in what is now Somerville, Massachusetts, and he had those troops collect all the militia gunpowder inside before it could be taken away by anyone opposed to it. He also had soldiers go into nearby Cambridge and collect 2 small cannon used by the local militia. As a response, the next morning, thousands of militiamen marched from the central part of the colony, marched into Cambridge. The Reverend Dr. Ezra Stiles, one of the leading ministers here in Newport, wrote a lot about this event in his diary. Here's how he described it the first time. General Gage seized the powder in the arsenal of Charlestown. This, with a false report that 6 men were killed in the seizure, was spread that afternoon. And on Friday morning, 2nd September, the body of the people in the towns for 30 miles around Boston instantly took arms and crowded into Cambridge, where there were about 4,000 were actually assembled. Finding the report as to the 6 men killed groundless, they accordingly enforced the resignation of several new councilors, and among the rest, Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver as councilor, and then dispersed. But the report, diffused and propagated far and wide, produced an extensive insurrection through the province of Massachusetts and Connecticut, even to the western parts of New England and the edge of New York. From the best accounts, I judge 30,000, or perhaps more than 1/3 of all the effective men in all New England took arms and were on actual march for Boston. This shows that for New England are ready to fight for their liberties. Now, Stiles' numbers might have been a little off. He really loved stories that reinforced his own views, and he would write those down in his diary very happily. But this militia alarm of September 2nd, 1774, called the Powder Alarm, was a major event because it showed that General Gage no longer had any authority outside Boston. He could not simply say, you have to do this because I'm the royal governor appointed by the king and this is what I think the law says. The bulk of the people were simply refusing to recognize the Massachusetts Government Act or any royal appointee acting under it. General Gage had troops to enforce his orders in Boston, but for the rest of, for all practical purposes, the rest of the colony was independent. And it was also quite clear that the surrounding colonies were going to support this recalcitrant bulk of Massachusetts. As an experienced militiaman, a military man, facing a much larger potential enemy, General Gage quickly took steps to shore up his position inside Boston. He stationed cannon on the narrow neck that led into Boston from the mainland. Boston looked very different back then. It was this peninsula rather than, now these days there are dozens of major highways going into Boston, all crowded. Back then there was only one street. And if you put cannon on that street pointing out at the countryside, you basically fortified the town. He also had the Royal Navy surround the town with warships, and he summoned more troops to Boston from Quebec and from New York City. And those steps, of course, upset the people of Massachusetts even more. So they responded by secretly starting to build an artillery force of their own. In fact, for the rest of September, there was what I call an arms race in and around Boston, with each side trying to grab as many cannon and mortars as they could. This is a calendar of the month, and all the days with blue stars show when the Patriot resistance got hold of cannon, and all the days with the red stars show when General Gage grabbed control of cannon. And you can see it was a very busy month. There were actually a lot of artillery pieces to grab. Merchants needed them to arm ships in the case the British Empire went to war again, and that meant hardware merchants would have cannon in their stock of inventory. There were dozens of cannon also in the batteries surrounding the, guarding the harbor from the Boston and Charlestown harbor. Some of those guns were already under the control of the British military, like the ones at Castle William, which is on the right here, the fortified island in the harbor. But the town of Charlestown, which is circled at the top, that had a battery containing 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning they could fire balls weighing 18 pounds. In the first week of September, people in Charlestown began to move the ammunition out of that battery. General Gage heard about this on September 7th. He sent an officer over to investigate. The people saw the officer. They figured out what was going on. Here's how Boston merchant John Andrews described how the people of Charlestown reacted. The inhabitants, suspecting what would take place, provided a number of teams, such as carried ship timbers, and slowed all the guns belonging to the battery and carried up country, together with the deposit of shot, etc. The soldiers arrived that night with orders to dismantle the fort and bring off all the ordnance, all the guns, but it was already empty. On September 12th, a diarist down here in Newport, in Dorchester, recorded, down at the bottom, the great gun was removed from Preston's Point at the mouth of the Neponset River. On the night of Wednesday, September 14th, so sailors from the Royal Navy entered Boston's North Battery and spiked all the guns there. In addition, the Boston Post Boy reported, the cannon in the batteries back of Governor's Island, also guarding the harbor, were removed by the general's order. So each side was just grabbing cannon as they could. Together, those actions by the Royal Navy, probably the Army, on September 14th, kept the shipping channel and the mouth of the Charles River safe for the Royal Navy's warships. Inside Boston, as I said before, the militia train had its own gun houses and its own small cannon. But that militia company had basically fallen apart. On September 5th, the company was supposed to have a training day, but Major Paddock had reaffirmed his loyalty to the royal government, and most of the remaining officers and men simply refused to serve under him. To make sure that the train's cannon didn't disappear like the guns in Charlestown, Governor Gage ordered a double guard to the new and old gun houses, which are circled in red on this map. But on the morning after the British military went into the North Battery, the Army discovered that someone had opened the side of the militia train's older gun house, and the 2 small cannon that were stored inside were no longer inside. So General Gage doubled the guard on the other gun house. On Friday, September 16th, Royal Artillery officers went to Major Paddock to collect the only key to the front door. An officer brought a number of artillery privates to move the train's remaining 2 brass cannon into the Army camp, which was on the common, or you can see, right across the street from that gun house. But when the squad opened that gun house, those guns were also gone. The officer searched the area for where those brass cannon might have been taken. He even looked inside the South Writing School, which was next door to the gun house, and showed a yard with it. He saw upwards of 200 boys practicing their handwriting in a space probably about this size. He saw the schoolmaster at his desk, with his foot bandaged and resting on a chest of firewood near the stove. The officer never inquired that the 2 cannon, which had just gone missing, were hidden inside that firewood chest under the wood. Nearly half a century later, in 1823, a man went on record taking credit for helping with this theft, a man who had been part of the Boston train back in 1774. His name was Samuel Gore, and he was a decorative painter. His father was a good friend of Major Paddock. His father's first apprentice was the other co-founder of the train. His brother-in-law was third in command of the company, as well as a leading son of liberty. So Samuel Gore was right in the middle of this unit and of the conflicts between Major Paddock and the other officers and men. According to Gore, Major Paddock, having been heard to express his intention of surrendering these guns to the British Army, a few individuals resolved to secure for the country a property which belonged to it, and which, in the present emergency, had an importance very disproportionate to its intrinsic value. In other words, they stole their own cannon. In 1823, Samuel Gore identified the other members of the train who were his Confederates in this scheme. This was almost 50 years later, so he didn't remember everyone's full name. He remembered Moses Grant, which makes sense because Gore and Grant married sisters, and then their children, who were cousins, married each other, so he couldn't forget Moses Grant. Gore remembered a man named Bulge, and the only Boston man associated with artillery who I can find is a sailmaker named Joseph Bulge. Gore remembered a man named Ridley, and also how a blacksmith named Whiston hid the cannon in his forge later in the fall of 1774, after they were removed from the school. And indeed, I found Richard Ridley and Obadiah Whiston were partners in a blacksmithing operation in the south part of town, and that year they were in fact making Boston's first street lamps. Now, I have a lot more to say about those brass cannon, what happened with them, how exactly they got out of that gun house, how exactly they got out of the school, and so on, in the road to Concord. But tonight I'm going to leave them hidden in Obadiah Whiston's forge in the south part of Boston and turn to events outside of the town. General Gage was trying to alert his superiors in London about what he was going through here in New England. On September 12th, he wrote to the Secretary of State for North America, Lord Dartmouth, "The country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunition in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good and bad." And on September 25th, the general wrote to his other boss, the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, "The New England provinces, except part of New Hampshire, are, I may say, in arms, and the question is not now whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for civil war. The whole country, from here to New York, armed, training, and providing military stores." But the ministers in London, when they received these messages from Gage, they thought he was overreacting. So instead of putting the imperial government on alert, Gage simply managed to destroy the ministers' confidence in him to be able to solve whatever problems he was overreacting to. Meanwhile, things were getting worse for him. In October, representatives of Massachusetts' towns met and formed a provincial congress, first at Salem, and then they moved a little bit farther away to Concord. More towns participated in that illegal gathering than had participated in the recent legal legislatures, and that shows the depth of support that had arisen within the Massachusetts countryside for opposing the royal government. On October 25th, the Congress Committee drew up a military budget, so they were ready to go to war. They called for 20 field pieces, 4 mortars, carriages, and other artillery supplies. In November, the Congress's Committee of Safety and Supplies voted unanimously to get 7 large pieces of cannon out of Boston to some place in the country. So those politicians were catching up to what was already going on, what towns and people were already doing individually. In December, things got even worse. The action moved out of Massachusetts, including down here to Rhode Island, which I think might be pleasing for some of you since this is built at the top about Rhode Island. On December 5th, 1774, the Rhode Island legislature convened in Providence. A lot of the business of that session involved military preparation. The legislature set out to revise the colony's militia law. It chartered new militia companies with names like the Scituate Hunters, the Providence Fusiliers, and the North Providence Rangers. On December 8th, that's, as Richard said, 242 years ago today, the Rhode Island legislature voted to move all the cannon now at Fort George, guarding Newport Harbor, excepting 2 18-pounders and 1 6-pounder, up to Providence. It appointed a committee of 3 men, all identified by their militia ranks, to take possession of those guns and move them. Now, the ostensible reason, the stated reason for moving the guns inland was that the French and Indians might attack at any time from Canada. So the interior needed to be protected. In reality, Governor Joseph Wanton very frankly told Captain James Wallace of the Royal Navy that Newport Fort was stripped of its guns to prevent their falling into the hands of the king. The legislature was removing some of its defenses from the colony's main commercial harbor because those defenses could be more easily taken by the royal military. At the same time, the Assembly authorized a committee to buy gunpowder to be stored by the Deputy Governor, Darius Sessions, in Providence, rather than by Governor Joseph Wanton in Newport, whom they were starting to lose trust in. So this amounted really to a shift of authority from Newport to Providence, late in December 1774. In the same session, here at Providence State House, the legislature considered a petition signed by 49 men offering to form themselves into a company by the name of the Train of Artillery in the County of Providence, and to study artillery. The first name on that list was Daniel Tillinghast, a 42-year-old merchant and distiller. He had married a daughter of the former governor, Stephen Hopkins, who had just been at Continental Congress, so Tillinghast was closely tied to the Rhode Island establishment. But the second name on that list, you can see, was John Crane, a housewife from Boston. He hadn't even lived in Rhode Island for a full year. But Crane had been a sergeant in the Boston train, and that company was very respected for knowing how to work artillery. So obviously they had recruited him to be part of this new militia company. Later that week, the legislature authorized the new company to purchase at their expense and for the use of the colony 4 brass cannon and 4 counters with carriages, implements, and utensils. 4 cannon on carriages, fully equipped, probably costs around 100 pounds, which is a big chunk of money. When Yankees are actually spending money, they're really committed to a cause. In Providence, Daniel Tillinghast inspected the cannon that had been removed from Newport. He went to work arranging for field carriages for 6 cannon, including the 4 new brass ones, probably. Field carriages were different from the carriages that you could use on ships and in batteries because they had to be more maneuverable to get around the battlefield and to stand up to the shooting of battles. The train of artillery voted to make Tillinghast their captain and John Crane the captain-lieutenant, or the second in command. The same day, the legislature made a big decision to appoint a major general of the colony's forces, which would be 3rd in command of the militia, after the governor and the lieutenant governor. In other words, a field commander who had no responsibility except to be actually commanding the militia in battle. And the man the assembly came up with was Simeon Potter. We don't have a picture of Potter, but this is a house he owned in Newport. In 1774, he was based in Providence, or outside Providence. He was 54 years old. He was a very wealthy man. He had served in the legislature for decades. In 1744, he had captained a privateer against the French and Spanish and came back with loot that had made his fortune. He had invested in slaving, he had invested in distilling, he had other businesses. He was a very wealthy man, therefore. He also was a very strong personality, let's say. In 1761, according to court records, Potter got into a fight with John Usher, who had admonished him, "There is whoring wherever you go." Potter beat up Usher, who was A, his own minister, and B, 74 years old. In 1772, Potter had personally led a boatload of men disguised as Indians against the Gadsden. So when the Rhode Island legislature looked around and they chose Simeon Potter to be the colony's major general, they chose a man who seemed to be always ready for a fight. And just to make clear what sort of fight they were expecting, the legislature revised Rhode Island's militia law to say that the forces within this colony shall march to the assistance of any of our sister colonies when invaded or attacked. They authorized that the cannon belonging to this colony could be used either in or out of the colony. So they were putting their military resources not just into defending Rhode Island, but also into supporting Massachusetts against General Gage and the Royal Military. The next time the Rhode Island legislature assembled was on April 22nd, 1775. And a lot had happened in between those sessions. War had broken out in Massachusetts, at Lexington, at Concord, and then on the road back to Boston on April 19th. The Massachusetts militia had risen up again and besieged the British inside Boston. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had asked all of its neighbors for military help. At that April session, the Rhode Island legislature also had received a request from the Train of Artillery at Providence and the Providence Fusiliers to combine their companies under Daniel Tillinghast with the name of the United Train of Artillery. And this time, when that merger came through, John Crane turned out to be 3rd in command. Ebenezer Stevens, the other housewife from Boston, he was one of the men petitioning for that merger. So this is the first time we know that he was associated with those companies. This is a recreation of the United Trained uniform by Charles Lefferts in the early 20th century. Now, during this session, this late April 1775 session, the Rhode Island legislature was really scrambling to catch up with what was already happening on the ground, because the war had already started out, and in fact, some Rhode Islanders were already ready to participate in the war. According to John Howland's recollection, word of the fighting at Concord reached Providence on the afternoon of April 19th. The drums of the four independent companies beat, and the men paraded as soon as possible. It was sundown, and the officers of the company were prepared to go to Lieutenant Governor Sessions, requesting him to give them orders to march toward Boston, as without his orders their authority would cease when they should have passed Pawtucket Bridge. He declined doing anything in the case, having no power on the colony. It was then concluded to send an express toward Boston to know whether the enemy had returned or were yet in the field, and to act or march on further intelligence, orders or no orders. So these militia companies were now ready to go into war, even if they were not getting official orders from their commanders. Early in the morning, Colonel James Barteau with his Greenwich company arrived, but would not stay. They continued their march miles beyond Pawtucket into Massachusetts. But then this company, the Kentish Guards, learned from a rider that the regulars were safe cooped up in Boston. The battle was over. So Bartau's company turned around and came back. Howland remembered seeing one particular soldier in that company. I viewed the company as they marched up the street and observed Nathaniel Greene with his musket on his shoulder in the ranks as a private. I distinguished Mr. Greene, whom I had frequently seen, by the motion of his shoulders on the march, as one of his legs was shorter than the other. In May 1775, the next month, the Rhode Island legislature met again in Providence. A lot had changed, and a big part of this business, they finally were getting around to codify those changes, to make them official. For one thing, Governor Joseph Wanton had been pushed aside, and Lieutenant Governor Douglas Sessions was presiding. The Assembly voted to create an army of observation to serve and be paid, again, Yankees spending money, to be paid through the end of the year, and it appointed officers for that army of observation. And the list of officers is interesting for who appears on it and who doesn't appear on it. Major General Simeon Potter doesn't show up anywhere. In fact, he stopped showing up for basically all legislative work, even when he was appointed to the upper house of the Rhode Island Assembly, and basically sat out the war, except when people came and asked him, can we use some of the cannon you have? And then he offered to sell the cannon for exorbitant prices. He was just not interested in fighting anymore. The Army of Observation included a train of artillery, but Daniel Tillinghast wasn't in charge. Instead, John Crane was listed as the captain of that company, and Crane's second in command is listed as Joseph Bulge. Now, where have we heard that name tonight? I named him as one of the 4 members of the Boston train who helped sneak the 2 guns out of the New gun house under Redcoat Guard and into the nearby school. I suspect that after that feat, he decided to get out of Boston too. Work for a sailmaker was probably not very good, plus he had just participated in a pretty daring crime, which he might not want to stick around in a town full of soldiers. Ebenezer Stevens was another officer in that company, the train of artillery, as part of the Army of Observation. He's not listed high enough to be here, but he was a lieutenant. He was probably in Crane's company. His commission is dated May 8th. The Rhode Island train marched to the siege of Boston with 4 new brass cannon. They had arrived, the biggest brass cannon of the Provincial Army, the whole Provincial Army at the time. No, none of the Massachusetts units had such nice shiny guns, brass guns. Crane probably oversaw 2 of those guns, Balto probably oversaw the other 2. Also at the very top of this list of officers from the Rhode Island Assembly, the Brigadier General in charge was Nathaniel Greene. Now, as of the previous month, Nathaniel Greene was merely a private, limping along in the Kentish Guards. And now he was in charge of everyone, including Colonel Barnum, who had been his commander in the Guards. This is one of the great mysteries of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. How did Greene jump so many ranks? Why did the legislature choose him above every other gentleman? And I propose that the answer is somewhat linked to the question of why the Rhode Island train of artillery was put under the command of men from Massachusetts who hadn't even been in Rhode Island for more than a year. Frankly, I think that nobody else wanted those jobs. Or at least nobody else wanted those jobs as much. Being in the Army, Rhode Island Army of Observation, meant leaving your home, which might come under attack, especially from the ocean, and going and helping somebody else. Given the size of the Rhode Island forces, it meant becoming a small frog in a much bigger pond. All the New England generals, regardless of their seniority within their colonies, were answering to Artemus Ward of Massachusetts, and then to John Thomas of Massachusetts, and so on. And General Greene was the least senior of all the New England officers. That was quite clear. It's not clear whether anybody who was older would have had any more seniority. They would have been pretty low on the totem pole coming from Rhode Island with only the number of troops that the colony was providing. Perhaps most important for Rhode Islanders, however, going into the Army meant not going into the Navy and not going on to privateers, which is probably a more prestigious form of service in a colony that was oriented toward Narragansett Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. Because of the prize system, furthermore, on the ocean you could not only kill the enemy, but you could make a killing capturing ships, capturing and their cargo. It was very significant, I think, that the first commander of the Continental Navy was Essex Hopkins from tiny Rhode Island. It wasn't a big colony, but it had lots of ships and crews and experience with naval warfare. And that was where I think the gentlemen of Rhode Island saw the greatest rewards. So they weren't interested in going to the siege of Boston. They were looking towards the ocean. On September 30th, 1775, United Trained Artillery, which was the members back in Rhode Island, really, elected new officers to replace the ones who were off fighting in Massachusetts. Daniel Tillinghast was still the commander, but Elihu Robinson replaced John Crane, and he resigned his membership at the end of the month. As it turned out, the officers of the Rhode Island that Rhode Island supplied to the Army besieging Boston turned out to include some very good officers. During the siege of Boston, which was mostly a frustrating stalemate, Captain Crane's company participated on some of the most significant raids against British positions. On July 8th, they attacked the Neck Guard, which was the unit that was guarding that narrow road into Boston. So they were right on the front lines. On July 30th, Crane's artillery supported an attack on the Boston Light, which was the lighthouse in the harbor, and they were able, the Americans were able to cripple that light and therefore cause a lot more difficulty for the British ships. Crane even managed to sink a British boat that was coming after the American raiders. Crane became a major in the Continental Artillery at the start of 1776. He became a colonel a year later, basically succeeding Henry Knox as commander of a regiment. He was one of the best field artillerists in the American Army, and he was especially good as a gunner, at being able to shoot and aim and see in his mind's eye the flight of the cannonball. And that hardy constitution, which had helped him recover from being knocked out at the Boston Tea Party, during the New York campaign in late 76, Crane was wounded in the foot, and so badly that he eventually developed lockjaw. But his immune system fought that off, and he went back on duty and served the rest of the war until October 1783. And at that time, he was brevetted as a brigadier general. Crane's second in command in May 1775, Joseph Bulge, he wasn't so committed to the Continental Army. He left that post, most likely at the end of the siege of Boston, but he was committed to protecting his hometown of Boston. And he became a captain in the Massachusetts Artillery Regiment under Thomas Crafts, Thomas Melville, Paul Revere, a bunch of other familiar names we know from Boston activists. And they served at other places at Castle William in Boston Harbor. And finally, Ebenezer Stevens also remained in the Continental Army. In the fall of 1776, he got a promotion and his own command in the Independent Battalion of Artillery, separate from Crane. They had a little spat over chain of command at one point. Lieutenant Colonel Stevens was at the two major British surrenders during the war, at Saratoga in 1777 and at Yorktown in 1781, and he also served until the last year of the war. And finally, as we know, Nathaniel Greene caught the eye of General George Washington when they met in Cambridge in July of 1775. And by the end of the war, Greene had performed so well that many military historians rank him as one of America's finest battlefield generals, if not the very best. So even though Greene may have won the command of Rhode Island's Army of Observation in 1775 because no one else wanted the job, he was just the right man for the job. And likewise, even though a lot of the Rhode Island train of artillery officers were actually from Massachusetts, they proved to be an important contribution from this colony to the new United States. Thank you. I'm happy to, there are some books out that I'm happy to sign later, but I'm happy to answer questions now. Yes, sir?
Can you give us any correlation or relation to the Newport Artillery Company? I know they were Queens established in the 1740s or something?
Yes, the Newport Artillery was established in the previous war, 1741. They were primarily here at Fort George, guarding the harbor. And it is basically Providence in 1774 is catching up to Newport as a town, but also saying, okay, we want our own artillery company as well. And I don't know, the Newport Artillery was still around in the 1770s. I wonder what they had to say about the fact that all the guns, except 3, were being taken away from Fort George.
I wonder who they fought for in 1775.
That's a good question.
If they were established as Queen's Artillery, you know, they must have been really confused when Boston, when the colonies declared war on Britain.
Well, up until, I mean, even up through the end of 1775, the American patriots saw themselves also as British patriots. They saw themselves as fighting for the British liberties, as fighting for the true British Constitution, which was, in their view, being corrupted by misguided officials in America and then by corrupt politicians in London. And they kept hoping to go get support from true British patriots in London and from the King to say, oh, we're terribly sorry, we should never have let these corrupt men put taxes on America, let's go back to the old system and all be happy together. And they kept waiting for that to happen. Up and through the end of 1775, when the King came out in a speech in Parliament very strongly against all that was happening in America. So that was how they reconciled going out, you know, having celebrations and shooting off your guns for the King and flying the British flag and feeling yourself to be fighting for British liberty with the fact that they were also fighting the British government. They were saying, oh, that British government is not really fighting, they are misguided on British liberty. And yes, I don't know, it would be interesting, maybe within this very building, there might be records of the Newport Artillery that would say who was a member in 1774, and we might be able to see, okay, how many of these men went to war, how many of these men went to war at sea, how many of these men became loyalists. It would be an odd thing for an artillery company to be happy not to have so much artillery anymore, something as happened in December 1774. Yes, sir.
The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Boston claimed 1639 as their founding date. How do you resolve this in terms of the fact that they're 135 years before this level of activity that you described tonight?
The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company is not an official militia company. It's a private organization, and therefore, and it was in the mid-1700s, it was functioning more or less as a training ground for men who wanted to become militia officers. So men like William Heath, he actually ran for militia officer in his town of Roxbury. He was not voted in, so he went and he joined the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company. He trained himself, he came back, he showed people, you know, I know what I'm doing now. They voted him in, and he eventually became a general in the Continental Army. The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company did not have any artillery at this time. It didn't have any artillery until the early 1800s. So even though it was called the Artillery Company, they marched around with their muskets and they trained that way. So it's easy to confuse. A lot of people do confuse the train as it's called, Major Paddock's Company, which was founded in the 1760s with the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, but they are completely separate organizations with separate legal status.
So would you say then that Newport is actually the first true artillery company in the
I'm
Province?
not, I would have to check to see if the Ancient and Honorables had artillery when they started, or whether that was always just aspirational, or the name artillery changed, or something like that. Because I concentrate on the 1700s, so I know at that point they no longer had big guns. Now, there was a company that, a militia company that manned the North and South batteries in Boston. There was the Charlestown Militia Company that manned the Charlestown battery. There were, until Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson turned Castle William over to the British Army, there was a militia company out there. So just as in Fort George had trained locals who could fire their cannons, so did Boston, so did everywhere, every small and large port along the eastern seaboard. So I'm not going to get into who was first on this, but certainly the Newport artillery does go back to 1741 and has its proud heritage. Yes, sir. You have your hand.
Did any of the Ford brass cannons survive?
2 of them survived. They were sent back to Massachusetts at the end of the war by Henry Knox, and he had them engraved with the story of the fact that they had been, they don't say stolen, but it's a story about how important they were at the beginning of the war. So once at that point, it's easy to identify those cannon because they have this engraving all over them. They're named the Adams and the Hancock. And therefore, we know what happened to them afterwards. In the 1820s, they were loaned out to none other than the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, who wanted to use artillery. And they had practiced with the artillery out in Boston Harbor, and they blew a big hole in one of those guns. And at that point, the Massachusetts state said, oh, okay, we're not going to let those out anymore. And they were put, instead, they were mounted at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument in 1842. They stayed there until one became loose in the 1970s and had to be taken down, and then was lost, and then was found under a pile of stolen bicycles in a police station, and was turned over to the Park Service and put in storage because they didn't know what to do with it until about 12 years ago when I came to them and said, you know, there's a story behind that gun. And now that gun has been restored and is at the Concord Visitor Center of Minuteman National Park, where people can see it. And the Adams gun, the other one, it was been taken down from the top of the Bunker Hill Monument where it's not climate controlled, and it was also been restored, and this spring it went on display at the bottom of the Bunker Hill Monument in that lodge, sort of museum area, where it is a lot more convenient to see than to go up all those stone steps. So yes, 2 of those guns survived, and we're very proud. So back there.
So during this period, where was the bulk of these artillery pieces being manufactured?
There was no manufacturer in America. They were coming from Britain or eventually from France and other countries. Most of we have this idea, or a lot of people have the idea that when Henry Knox brought cannon back from Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, those were the first cannon for General Washington's army around Boston. In fact, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the rebels, had collected, by their own count, 38 cannon before the war even started. That was why the British went out to Concord, because they were going after these cannon. Those cannon, all the 4 that had been stolen from Boston, were iron guns. They were heavy, they were old, they had come off ships, they had come out of batteries, and they were less maneuverable. But they had been in service probably, you know, the wars with the French going back decades. They may have been they were probably mostly British guns. Some of them might have been captured French guns or captured Spanish guns. If you captured a nice heavy iron tube, you put it to use for your side as soon as you could. So it wasn't until later in the war that the Americans started to produce their own cannon, and they really didn't get a good supply for a while. So So most of the cannon that they were using during the war were coming from France and Holland. Yes?
Was there any correlation between the failures of Richard Ridley and maybe the rise of the United Train of Artillery and John Crane?
Richard Ridley was the first commander of the American artillery, the Massachusetts artillery, which was then, Crane was sort of put under him to be part of what became the Provincial New England artillery and then the Continental artillery. Richard Ridley was an old man. He was in his 60s. He had participated in the Massachusetts expedition against Louisburg in the 1740s. He had participated in the French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s. He was extremely respected in Massachusetts, and he just wasn't up to the job. And even worse, after he got wounded at Bunker Hill, he was recuperating back home in Stoughton, Massachusetts, and sending all his messages, all his orders into the siege through his son, Scarborough Ridley, who he had insisted on having Scar being made a major. Scar totally embarrassed himself at the Battle of Bunker Hill, wouldn't even go into the battle. Sort of stayed outside and took pot shots at a ship in the harbor. So nobody respected Scar Ridley, and therefore Colonel Richard Ridley was losing respect. And by October, George Washington went to a committee from the Continental Congress and told them Colonel Ridley has become obnoxious to the Artillery Corps and had to be replaced. Now, I don't think the United Train of Artillery or the Rhode Island, the two companies from Rhode Island, I don't think that they were directly associated or with that controversy, except in one respect, which was that Crane was doing well.
Yeah.
And so it was an obvious example that it was possible to actually do something effective as an artillerist during this siege. A lot of the fortifications around Boston were being built by men who were not in Ridley's regiment, but men who were like Rufus Putnam from an infantry regiment, or like Henry Knox, a volunteer who had no army commission at all. And as I say, by October, George Washington, well, even by August, the month after he arrived, George Washington realized that Ridley was not up to the task. And by October, he was trying to push him out. And indeed, he could see in Knox, in Crane, and other young men, a much more vigorous and less parochial interest in being artillery officers. One of the things that happens at the end of the siege, the Army, of course, had to move south. The second in command of the artillery regiment at that point said, actually, I signed up to defend Massachusetts, I'm staying here. The third in command had been wounded, and therefore was also staying in Massachusetts to recover, although he had a good excuse. And then there was Crane. So Knox and Crane were the only officers who went down to New York. And I haven't looked at the original muster roll, but I've looked at the statistics, and the actual strength of the artillery regiment drops very strongly in that shift. So probably when those officers left, a lot of other people stayed behind in Massachusetts as well. So in that respect, it was very good that they had, that the Continental Army had artillerists who weren't simply tied to Massachusetts. Most of them, a lot of the younger Massachusetts officers went along with the Army and stayed with the Army and did good service. But that top tier were not as interested in the, as we say, the United cause. Yes, sir.
Was there any evidence that any members of the militia in Massachusetts were Tories or Loyalists?
Let's see. Well, yes. I mean, people like Major Paddock were Loyalists, and some men before the war even used the fact that they had been given these militia ranks as their reason for staying with the king. I feel grateful. I swore an oath to the king. In fact, Samuel Gore, the man who talked about stealing the cannon, his father had been a militia captain, and his father became a loyalist because of that oath. However, in the late 1774, one of the first things the Massachusetts Provincial Congress did was to tell the local militia companies, basically purge the loyalists, have new elections, choose men who are whom you support. In Massachusetts, in New England, in fact, militia companies elected their officers up to the level of captain. And therefore, after November 1774, the men who were clearly siding with the crown were no longer welcome as militia officers. And my bet is that if they showed up during militia training or during the alarms, they were welcome, but they weren't fully accepted. And if they didn't show up, nobody was going around saying you should have. They were taking notes that these guys weren't supporting the cause, but they were not really interested in going into war beside them. And this happens all on my website right now. I'm talking about a situation in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, out in the western part of the state, in late 1776, when the town's Church of England followers have gotten together and voted as a bloc to put in very weak militia officers. And so the more radical part of the town is saying we need new elections, and the moderates are saying, well, yeah, we don't like this, but we already have elections. And the Anglicans are all saying, well, we won, but we're not going to war anyway. And so it has to be completely worked out by the committees of safety at that time. So yes, there were still loyalists around, but the most of the militia officers were strongly supportive of the resistance. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.